In the process of cleaning up and completing the inventory of the fasteners for the GSX, I ran across many that didn't meet the grade, stuff that I wouldn't use in a thing that I label a restoration. Not all these are bad, but there were some shining examples of the kinds of things that you shouldn't put into a hole, and I suppose a few holes that you shouldn't put things into. There are those. If you've been following along, then you know that I ordered replacements for these things, and some of them have arrived. That shipment had to come from 2 different countries to accomplish my ridiculous goal of using all factory replacement fasteners for a car that's 3 decades old, and counting. Watch out for staples. Sourced by Amiyama, this time from the United Arab Emirates, this completes parts group sections 26 through 37 regarding wherever I came up short. Joke's on me, this car's 100% made in America. In order to get my parts, most of them have to come from Oman. But anyway, this should complete everything associated with the subframe, suspension, axles, steering, and brakes on the GSX. There were only 3 fasteners that I wasn't able to find, but now I have the task of sorting and figuring out where all of this stuff goes. I'll find substitutions for those missing ones. One of the many reasons why I made a video about mining all my car's parts data from all the sources available to me was to make this moment a piece of cake. That spreadsheet made my original inventory a whole lot easier. It made ordering the missing and replacement parts easier, and it makes figuring out where all of this stuff goes a no-brainer. Now I can glance at a diagram, match a reference to the spreadsheet, and know exactly what and where everything is, where does it live. I think this is a mess that a lot of people who wrench on things find themselves in, so those were my methods. By the end of this boring stuff, I was able to match up all the parts that I had with the parts that I needed, and to get their quantities straight before attempting any assemblies. The far left column is the stuff that I have on hand. The highlighted green stuff is it's the quantities that were corrected in the 7 parts groups that I have to assemble in order to get this car off my lift. Some of these modifications I'll be performing may even negate the need for some of this stuff, but I have it either way to prevent any interruptions. Sometimes it's obvious when a bolt dies because you have the threads of the part still embedded in them. Then you've got the salt and mineral damage one that strips at the outer finish of the bolt, gets coarse, and it begins to waste away and erode. But then you got the worst case scenarios where that rust won that fight and there's no threads left, they stripped right off the last time it was removed. I don't want to see stuff like that anywhere on this car. So after picking all the winners and losers, I've bundled each parts subgroup together in bags and boxes and stretch wrap bundles. This is section 35, which is the brakes, and section 35 has the most parts subgroups of anything else that we're dealing with. All this is brakes. Section 37 is steering. Here we've got the inner and the outer tie rods, a rebuild kit, and all the bolts are sorted and bagged, ready to go. Then there's what remains of section 33. That's the suspension parts in 050 and all the arms and members associated with it from section 110. Bolts included in here too. It's a whole lot of stuff, but I've verified that it's all here, and in order to make it a whole lot less stuff that I, have scattered everywhere, I want to start preparing assemblies because it lets me simplify the handling and storage of all the stuff while the pieces come together. And there are comments about masking parts, and you can see that was done here where it matters, but areas like these ball joint holes are an easier thing to just clean up than they are to have to mask. It's just easier for everyone involved. I have no problem with cleaning up powder coat during assembly. Even on the most meticulously prepared powder coat jobs, I've always had to do it. I'd rather, the parts were fully coated and only to have to remove what's necessary. So in my book, this powder coat is perfect. There's no coating in the threaded holes. There's no coating on any of the bearing, mating, flange surfaces or the bolt surfaces where it matters. This is exactly correct. Cleaning up tapered ball joint holes is totally acceptable, and that's a quality control process on a restoration that you have to do anyway, whether or not the coating's there. There's lots of places where it doesn't belong, so there's plenty of reasons to mask parts off, but it's ideal not to mask it here, because corrosion only starts from where you didn't coat. These parts only contact on that taper. I'd rather have that coating right up to that point of contact. Abe's 7-degree ream always does such a dang nice job cleaning these things up, and I'm sure you're just as tired of seeing this thing as he is of me borrowing it. The front 2G knuckles have 8 tapered holes to clean up because they have 4 points of contact with the frame, rather than the 3 that you'll find on a 1G. You can see how the holes are only slightly tapered, and where that runs out, everything else is coated. This is what's going to offer the best corrosion resistance all the way up to where it meets the ball joint. I know that seems like a silly little detail, but this is where the car gets the dirtiest, the crustiest, the wettest, and someday later when somebody has to serve it, it's going to be easier for them to do that. That person's probably going to be me. That's right. You're being good to yourself. You're not just being good to the car and its parts when you spend time on little details like this and clean up all the threaded things. I'm going to clean up that light flash rust from humidity before moving forward too. It's a good idea to season the parts with some oil or something to protect it when you're done. It's really satisfying to knock all of this off and make these things look better than new prior to assembly, because I have a collection of parts coming soon to these Knuckles that simply just doesn't exist anymore, and I'm very fortunate to have all of them. It's not these brand new Mitsubishi hub bearing assemblies either. You can still get these, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't savor the experience of unboxing new factory parts while you still can. Totally. I mean, do that. Savor it. What I'm talking about here is these two brake dust shields. These things cannot be replaced. They're specific to this car's brake and rotor assembly with these Knuckles. They've been out of production for over a decade, and the only ones left in the wild are flakes of rust right now because they were only painted steel. I have some late run replacements that were practically rust free that were straightened up and powder coated. They're not perfect, but as far as I'm concerned, they're the best ones in existence right now. If you don't have them and you want them, you somehow have to make them. You can't stretch these things over the wheel bearings, so they kind of have to go on first. They're secured with a single bolt, and to line that up, I just drop a couple of M12 bolts through the brake caliper bracket holes, and it does a trick. You can adjust it later, but why have to? I use anti-seize on the hub bearing bolts and also the gap between the hub bearing and the knuckle, because I've had these parts fused together into a single part before. Never underestimate the power of salt. You watch me destroy the whole rear passenger corner trying to get the knuckle off the seized axle and hub. Now it's completely reborn. Glad I saved it, because it's not just the dust shields that are scarce. These are also things that are only available in the used market now. Habits that preserve things are just good ones to develop in general, and I'm glad I'm doing all of this. Hub bearing bolts ultimately get 65 foot-pounds. That's all of parts group 26-150, restored and reassembled with extreme rust prevention measures in less than 4 minutes. Minus the brake rotors, of course. In the scene that follows next, the word available only means on the whiteboard. Do with those numbers what you can to find whatever you're looking for. You see the Knuckles are available for ABS or non-ABS cars, and the part numbers are different for left or right hand side. A couple other parts are like that. The brake dust covers are the same whether you have ABS or not. The hub bearing assembly is several parts put together. Basically, you get the hub, the bearing, and it comes with all the wheel studs. They're M12x43, but you don't need to be concerned with that. They come with the assembly, so if you order that part number, you get all that assembled. The brake rotor is actually in this parts group. It's interesting that they put that there because none of the rest of the brake parts are. They get their own little group somewhere else, and that'll just fall off if you set it on there and wait for them. All right, fine. They're part of the parts group, so let's truly wrap that one up. Hey, where'd you come from, 27250? I suppose that is on a different line item. It does say 2G Knuckles above it. I guess we're doing all of the Knuckles since this says 2G Knuckles. And for the rear Knuckles, 27250 has not just different sets of Knuckles for the left and right side of ABS and non-ABS cars, but they also break them up by year. And so basically the first generation of the 2GAs from 94, January of 94 till June of 95, they were manufacturing the cars with that set of part numbers, and from July of 95 until the end of production with those part numbers. Actually, my data runs out at 98. I believe they did something different in 99. The rest of the parts are in this group. There's only one bolt to be concerned with. One bolt. M10x43. Surprise, it's the same length as the wheel studs that are M12x43. But these M10x43 grade 10 bolts, 8 of them, hold the hubs to the assembly. Hubs are just like the front. If you order this hub assembly, you get the studs already installed with the bearing and the hub. The rear brake disc is included. You'll see there's different things that they did for different years, and there's a good reason for that. 9401, January of 94 to October of 94, it was these part numbers. From 94 November to June, the end of June 95, it was these part numbers. From July 95 on through the end of my data, it was that part number. So there's 3 different things they did with the brakes. You'll notice that the brake rotor part numbers are the same right there, so maybe there's really not that much different, but that's in my data. Could just be a part number revision. Who knows? Last thing, rubber plug, MB487635. Since it was on the whiteboard, I guess I have to assemble it. You probably saw the notes there. My October 94 2G is the early one that's equipped with the rear drum brake setup that's sandwiched between the hub and the knuckle. I've got both backing plates for the rear brakes right here, freshly powder coated and completely out of production. I also have the rear hub bearing assemblies as well, and I'm going to bolt these in once I've got the bushings installed into the rear knuckles. There's a drum brake parts kit, and I don't know if it's weird or not to find factory original brake pads, but thank you, STM Tuned. At least I get the experience of using them to replace the factory original set 148,000 miles later. The whiteboard sort of caught me a little bit off guard. I wasn't expecting to have to be doing all this. I thought I was here just to focus on finishing up the front end of the car, and I don't even understand my own directions sometimes. I didn't do anything to protect these aside from leaving them under wraps since they were coated, and now I have to clean out all the surface rust off of the bare cast areas, the bolt holes, the rear sway bar link holes, and ABS sensor holes. So, bust out the Dremel and the wire wheels for most of it. I enjoy this part because it's by far the easiest process I ever get to do that makes a major and immediate visual impact. I've already gone through a whole lot of trouble to make the vast majority of these beautiful, but after doing all this to a part and then finishing it off like this with a wire wheel, it looks even better than it did brand new. The one place where there's coating right now that helps with what I'm about to do is the bushing bosses. They're not coated from the factory because they have a discontinued steel sleeved rubber bushing in them, and that factory bushing isn't ever coming back to my knuckles. I'll be using poly bushings, and the super smooth texture of this coating was actually going to help with that installation, and it's also going to hold the bushing a little more snug because the powder coat has a thickness. So I'm leaving those bushing bosses alone, no need to remove that. The rear 2G knuckles don't use ball joints for the connection to the rear arms and subframe. There's only one tapered hole on the rear knuckles for the sway bar end links, but naturally I want those to fit perfectly too, so I'm reaming out that tapered mount in the hole. And, of course, it's also me, so what do I have to go and do next? That's right, put my finger in it. I ran a chase through the non-blind hole for the ABS sensor bolt. The front holes are blind, but most of these bolts snapped right off, leaving me digging them out with drills, hammers, and punches. One area I can't afford to leave alone is the ABS sensor holes. These sensors are not only plastic, they're vanishing from existence, so if I ever have to disassemble this again, I need them to be able to come back out easily. I'm knocking that texture down and cleaning out the stray powder coat dust from the boss. It just happens here because the hole is weird. Stick your finger in it. So finally, once it comes time to put an ABS sensor in it, I want it to fit like this. Thanks to a viewer who had the part, I now have all 4 of the sensors to replace these with and maintain my ABS system. I know I won't be this lucky again in the future. I know it. Thank you. Appreciate you, man. I'm not installing anything until those bushings are pressed in, though. I figured I'd use the hydraulic press, but all my friends want me to use the bushing press. And that means that I finally, after 24 years from when I bought this bushing set, I'm finally getting a chance to open it up and use it. It's time. I've lugged that thing around with me for nearly half my life now. There's 6 bushings to install in the rear knuckles, some silicone paste and some sleeves included. But let's try to use the bushing press and see how I can do with the easy ones. So many other people were confident that I could do this, and nope, which stinks because I even found rigging that had a tapered part on the back to hold that bushing straight. Let's try the flat edge side. And nope. No. I'm not juggling this all day. For the easy ones, I'm just going to go see what the hydraulic press does. Oh no, it's trying to fire out. This is not good. I had one oversight here. The bushing kind of needs a recess beneath it, under the boss, to let the rest of the bushing pass through it, and I didn't leave that provision. After clamping it all the way back in, I was able to rotate it in between the blocks of wood and get the bushing all the way through it. It's not how I want to do this, but that smooth texture and all the grease prevented me from damaging the bushing doing something like that. There's no sharp edges on this thing, and the powder coating kind of rounded it all off a bit, so I got it all the way through. Now just do that 5 more times. But I'm going to do it right this time. Grease them up and make a mess. For the rest of them, I used this piece of the bushing press kit that gave it adequate support. The bushing press is likely ideal for a sleeved bushing, but these bare poly bushings aren't rigid enough to cooperate. You saw me give it a try, and I did need parts of that kit for the hydraulic press, so I call this a compromise. You need both, or at least part of the kit. For those two bushing bosses with a bad angle, here's my solution that I imagine working for me, and it's not perfect either. Since the bushing press kit didn't fit in between these two, put the bushing on a block of wood. I noticed the angled bushing boss is directly centered overhead of the hole in the other bushing below it, so I just centered that one up on the press and used it to force the part down onto the bushing. The bushing is going to give long before the part ever does. I would not do this with a sleeve bushing, but fortunately you can't get them anymore, so nobody's going to break their irreplaceable rear knuckles doing this. And it's not perfect to do it this way because you have to support the part with your other hand to keep it all centered and straight, and it's easy to screw that up too. But the amount of force required to do all this is likely far less than a ton. I'm glad that worked out like it did. Last thing I wanted to do is carry around a bushing set for quarter century and then accidentally damage one installing it. I think these bushings thank me for doing all this over blocks of wood and for the powder coat, and I've read horror stories about other people struggling to do this job over the years. You're welcome to leave yours in the comments. But this has actually turned out to be a lot easier than I had imagined. It's not the most fun job. For instance, I hate this grease, and I still fail at my own methods just like the other methods people recommend. But eventually I do always seem to get it right. To wrap the bushing install, just grease and insert all the pins however you have to. Press on them, beat on them, do a combination of both, maybe a C-clamp. The press would even work, but it's completely unnecessary. It really doesn't matter at this point because the hard part's already done. Sure, the grease sucks, but not even the cleanup has to be difficult. I'm just doing my WD-40 and microfiber rag cleanup to deal with all my greasy handprints, and in no time these are now finally like the ones in the drawing. They have bushings in them. Bushing service typically meant replacing the rear knuckle with a new factory one, but these are both now restored and ready to be reassembled. So congratulations to me for finally accomplishing that thing that only lets me start. Oh yeah, I left one of these out. Should be the end. It's the last one left on the whole car. Won't have to deal with that anymore. That'll be the last time I ever stick my finger in that. We're done. Oh man. There's only a few parts that are unique in that they're left and rights. The struts for the parking brake, the lever for the parking brake, and the backing plates themselves. There's a shoe set, left and right matters on that too, but you assemble all of that. I opt for doing them in a pair rather than individually. Everything else that you see in the image that's labeled is actually in the centric kit. All of it, it's all in there. All the clips, all the adjusters, all the springs, all the retaining clips, even the grease. It's all in there. I think I did a pretty good job. I was a little bit mad at the whiteboard for making me do this because those aren't knuckles. I totally wasn't ready for doing anything with the rear of the car yet. I was doing all my preparations for the front subframe. That's what we're supposed to be working on, isn't it? Someone tell Jaffro he needs to be more considerate about those of us who have to do all the work because the rear knuckles have lots of other systems bolted to them. It's not just knuckles. My bolt and inventory game wasn't up to snuff for this yet. If there's anything to be learned from seeing all this again, it's that if you always use the same silverware tray for every batch that's in the sealer at the end, then you won't contaminate any of the other chemical baths as you cycle batches through it. Water and chemicals that make it into the sealer settle to the bottom, and you can pour off all the sealer back into the can when you're done and reuse it again later. I did all of my bolts in the small batches, so 1 pint bottle of the black oxide included in the kit, dispersed into 50 milliliter small batches all along, managed to make it all the way through the entire engine and subframe bolts of one whole car. One single kit. I prefer to do this way in small batches because there's just so many different types of fasteners involved in a restoration that you can't just throw them all in a bucket and never expect to get them back in the right holes again afterwards. This is the reason why I'm filling all the bolt grades on everything that I'm encountering into this database, and sometimes even buying new bolts when I don't know what I'm looking at, just to compare them. I want to get all this data correct, because if anyone ever did end up with all their bolts in one bucket, they'd really want to have this info. I think it'll help me for the rest of my life. There are exactly a dozen risers for the e-brake shoes between both brake backing plates, and these are friction surfaces against which the brake shoes slide on, and they're held in place by, so they're sort of like the risers that make it all fit correctly. I want the powder coating gone from here to keep everything aligned and to prevent anything from ever sticking. Powder coat being thick and soft, it's not in the engineer's drawings, so after buzzing all that stuff off with a flap wheel and patience, feel around here and clean up any rough and sharp stuff that I feel, and I think that's going to do it. Now I need to change tools and clean out the e-brake cable guides too. I don't want coating between the cable and the guide either. I can imagine someday this one sits for a long period of time with the e-brake cable tight, heat cycling, and it sticks. Plus, I need to be able to fit the e-brake cable end up here and clip it in place too. That needs to fit. Just give them a quick buff to clean up any of my mess and give these knuckles a brake shield and bearings. This isn't a repair. The original bearings weren't actually bad. Sure, one did seize to the axle, but they all looked horrible. This might have been costly, but it was worth the peace of mind. Not only do I not have to clean up anything, I'm preparing the car for a long life with no worries about what the parts have left in them. I already know. Let me just grab those 8 bolts that were just black oxided, and those are in primo condition. I only had to wire wheel their heads and their butts. Not a mark on them otherwise. I'm coating the threads of all these with anti-seize to pay it forward, just to get them all ready before I stack this sandwich. I do the same thing to the flange and the mating surface against the brake dust shield and the knuckle as well. And when it comes time to assemble it, the whole powder coating has a thickness thing shows up for yet another example. It's another helpful example in my opinion, because the hole is now smaller than the lip on the bearing. It now fills any gap that would have let water or contamination of any kind hang out and occupy it. I've coated the rest with anti-seize, which will smash against the flange surface and the hub wherever I want it, filling those gaps, and using a bearing as a punch against the hole to break away only that coating that interferes means there's going to be no rattles, no corrosion, and now let's sneak some bolts in it to keep it all aligned and stacked up like this. Run all 4 of those down nice and tight. Let's go to plaid now while I do the other one, because there's nothing to explain. It's 4 bolts. There's no Mitsubishi part number or parts group listing that lets you order this knuckle with the drum brake on it, but Jafro put it on the whiteboard, so let's go ahead and load up the parking brake and put that stuff together. They recommend that you use lithium grease for these things. Lithium grease is ideal for application to vertical surfaces and drum brake parts because it stays put, has great resistance to moisture, and it's not excessively slippery, and it maintains its lubrication over a long period of time in heat cycles. It's also waterproof too, but I want some other non-mineral based grease embedded in the metal beneath it first. It's not necessary, it's just my preference. Let's go ahead and tear into those new factory brake shoes and get all the hardware swapped over from the old ones. Some things that I need to do this with are in that centric kit, so I guess I gotta bust that open too. I like most of my hardware better than what I found in this, except that I also busted one of my springs taking it apart. It functioned perfectly before I did that to it. The old brake shoes would have even passed my state inspection. I wasn't hard on my equipment. All this complication does is the emergency brake or the parking brake. This has nothing to do with the pedal. It's a system that's completely separate from the hydraulic braking system. I get that it's all in the knuckle sandwich, but someone needs to tell Jafra this ain't 27250. I need a horseshoe clip and a wave washer in order to move the e-brake levers over because these are single-use items. Yeah, you can reuse them, but you really shouldn't, or at least you should be prepared to replace anything that's bad, which is why I bought this kit. You figure out right from left by locating the pins. Put the pins facing you on the top, and those are the rear set for both sides of your car. The fronts are easy to figure out because you can only mount them one way. With the levers cleaned up and swapped, let's get a close-up tour of the tiny DSM rear inner hub emergency drum brake assembly. I have everything laid out here related to the rear brakes. Right and left matters on most things on a 2G rear brake system, and everything that's important, fortunately, is really easy to figure out and determine where it all goes. The number one indicators, I think is probably the most helpful, is how the arms themselves are labeled left or right. You see that? Left, right, which is convenient. Some of the other parts are as well. It's clearly notated right. But aside from that, there's just kind of some general rules that go along with the use of drum brakes and things that are helpful to know, like the direction of the adjusters. The screw part on a DSM, if you're sitting in front of the wheel, always points left. And only left, no matter what. Left or right hand side, that faces left. If you don't, then your brake adjusters don't work. If you get that backwards, it'll actually loosen the brakes instead of tighten them.
aside from that, there's two different size springs. There's a heavy spring and a light spring. The heavy spring should always go on the side that's the anchor spring. They should always go on the side that has the e-brake arm that actuates the e-brake. That thing. So the heavy side always goes on that. That part is always going to be opposite of where the brake cable comes through to engage it. So that's going to change from one side to the other here. But one thing that doesn't change is the rear calipers always face the front of the car. So if for some reason you don't have the right or the left on your arms, for whatever reason that would ever happen, the calipers face the front of the car. Once I start trying to assemble that, it's going to be almost impossible for you to see on the inside of it what I'm doing, because everything's going to be obstructed. So I figured I would lay this out first to make sense. And down here we've got the original adjuster from the factory, and we've got the one that came in the centric kit, and I decided not to use this. I also decided not to use the springs they included because they kind of have a different shape than the factory ones. See, the hooks are different. See that? And as a result, these right here, these just kind of barely make it into the hole. And here's the holes they go into. They just barely get in there, and I don't feel confident about that staying put. So back to the factory ones. There's nothing wrong with them anyway. They're, you know, this is how they came out. So aside from not using that or their springs, I didn't use two of the springs that hold the brake pads in place. The reason why is because all four of the ones they included were that kind, and the factory said there's supposed to be two different weight of springs. So right here you can see there's two different springs in this one. One's yellow and one's blue. The factory service manual didn't make it too clear, but the yellow one is the heavy spring, and you want the heavy spring to always be on the side with the e-brake lever, and the light spring is the opposing shoe that just kind of keeps it snugged up. There you have it. I'll do my best to show you how this works for me. We'll go ahead and start with the brake pad side, or basically this is the recessive side. This isn't the one that does all the braking action. And when you put this thing on, there's a pin that holds it in place. And if we insert that from the back side of here, you will see that it pokes out right here, and your ability to be able to rotate that thing once it's in place matters, because when you're installing this, you're going to be pressing on one side with this, and it's easier actually to rotate the pin than it is to rotate this while you're pressing on it. So that goes there, goes through the hole in the brake pad, spring, clip, press that down, and it's rotated. So that piece snugs up there. It's held in place by a spring, which goes into a hole here on the top of the small hole on top of the brake pad, and then that spring is stretched over a post. And this is one of those places where I just prefer to use a screwdriver with the spring and kind of hook that around it and just stretch this brake pad forward and snap that in place. There you have it. Next, turn it around and start feeding it its other bits.
We'll just not remind Jaffro that he left the eccentric washer off the post before he installed either of the springs. Idiot. The fulcrum rod spring goes on the forward pad side. Some cars have a perch for this spring, but a DSM doesn't. The long leg of the back of the fulcrum rod should be facing out at you, and if it's not, you've got the wrong one from the other side of the car. By the time you've got the brake pads installed, you only get between a ½ inch to 5/8 of an inch to get your fingers in there and complete the entire spring-loaded assembly. That's why I got so long-winded over the table showing you parts. But once you've got the fulcrum rod located properly and both spring pins securing the pads, the rest goes in really easily. Clean, dry, and re-grease your brake adjuster assembly. You'll notice here that I'm using the included lithium grease for this. The stuff that I used earlier would be too thick. And now with the adjuster ready to go, insert it into the assembly on the bottom with the threaded side facing left, and secure the bottom of both brake pads against it with the long spring. You're done. It's cramped, tiny, and hard to show you, but I did my best. Of course, I noticed that I left the eccentric washer off that post like 5 seconds into assembling the next one. I was all like, wait a minute, there shouldn't be 2 of those on the bench. Don't. Oh well, I get it. I didn't get it wrong on this one, but I'm not even mad. That should be the first thing you put on before the front pad. You can put it on after too, it just needs to go on before the springs. But hopefully for the rest of what's involved in this parking brake assembly, if the back end of your car is in pieces in a bucket somewhere, I hope this helps you figure out where everything goes. It's not that big of a deal to find that washer left on the workbench because it's only 2 springs to have to pull to put it in place, and you know how easy this is already. There's your 2 Knuckles with additional drum parking brake assembly knocked out. That's 3 parts groups. I hope the whiteboard's happy now. What? Seriously? No, I just rebuilt those. Alright, there's already a great demonetized video on here called How to Rebuild 95 GSX Brakes that covers the entire factory rebuild of a freshly powder coated set of calipers by my friend Tony that you're looking at right here. It's from late 2009. Those of you who watched last year's shootout video already know who Tony is. Between a transmission rebuild, turbo replacement, and a main bearing failure, I have like maybe only 750 miles on these brakes. Tony, your powder coat's holding up great after 15 years. Most of the hardware doesn't even go in the bucket, it just wipes clean. Seriously, look at this. Unwashed. Just some surface rust that rubbed off from the disc, but otherwise glossy paint and rust free with the entire friction surface fully intact. I can even read the printed part number on it. With these rotors and pads, I had the best working brake combo I'd ever had on this car before, and with all brand new fluid in them too. I'm not rebuilding these again, and I can't if I wanted to because the parts kit doesn't even exist today. I'd have to piece the entire thing together from individual seals that are like or near fits. I already prepared for this eventuality back when I rebuilt them the first time. These are good. But what I will do is knock all the dust and cobwebs off of them, reapply new copper antices to the shims and the guides after polishing them back up, just to look like what they did 15 years ago and put it all back together again. That's really all they're going to get out of me today, and it's more than they needed. But I like how it looks, and that makes me happy. 4 grade 10 M12 by 28.5 millimeter bolts and M12 washers secure the brake assemblies to the knuckle. If your brakes were made after September 96, so basically a 97 and up, then it's 4 M12 by 25.5 millimeter flange bolts. Flange bolts, not bolts and washers. Aside from the lock and the guide pins that belong to the calipers, those caliper bracket bolts are the only bolts in this entire parts group. So might as well drop these rear rotors on here so that we can officially wrap up the rear knuckle and hub bearing and parking drum brake assembly, including the rubber plugs. See that? That's Knuckles plus 2 other parts groups and... Of course. So you want the rear brakes, do you? Yeah. Well, they were part of the other video too. I'm telling you, just gonna get a bucket wash and refresh like the front ones. I can't wait to keep using the best functioning brakes this car's ever had. Squeakers on the inside rears, new antices, and a good hand polish with WD. I'm telling you, it works. It removes oxidized rubber too. You want to clean your lawnmower? Yeah, I don't want to do that either. Each caliper gets 2 very specific grade 10 M10 by 19.5 millimeter bolts and a specific pair of 3 millimeter thick washers. This is so that the bolts seat flush in front of the rotor. This is another set of brake bolts just like the front ones that got substituted for flange bolts from 97 on. 2 of my rear caliper bolts were featured early in the video in the dead bolt collection. My brake bolts need threads. They gotta have them. And I ordered 4 new ones, but they're discontinued. That got canceled on me. I was very sad to get that update, but their very specific length means that I've only got a rusty-headed grade 7 bolt that can hold its place until I get it all figured out. I'm going to try ordering a full set of flange bolts and see what happens. One rusty, ugly bolt, but it's temporary. The top line is the early 2G production that was discontinued. There's the specs. There's the special accompanying rock washer from the good old days. Yeah, that's right. I said rock washer. Before anyone gets upset, this is the actual part name. I've got a whole factory sack of rock washers with its factory printed labels. That's what it's called. See that? I don't know, man. I just work here. I dug through my spares, and I don't have them. Rejected in both Japan and the Middle East for the originals, but I'll probably have better luck ordering those flange bolts instead. I think that they just got sick and tired of bolts and washers. Naturally, they're going to be 3 millimeters shorter without the rock washer. I didn't grind all the zinc off of these. They didn't need it.
Just look at how these turned out.
Just the hexes, the threads, the bolts, and the washers got the wire wheel. These rear shock mounts are actually part of section 3410 rear subframe. These aren't part of the Knuckle parts group, but that's where they're attached. I'm just going to go ahead and install these before somehow 3 pages of rear subframe parts appear on the whiteboard. So I'm doing this as a preemptive strike. This is prevention. And we're supposed to be working on the front subframe anyway. That's the whole reason I did this thing with the steering. I get the front knuckles, but all this rear stuff and brakes. Man, now I know he's doing this on purpose. You can't install the e-brake cables without completely disassembling the rear brakes. Right after I got the last bolt in? Really? The timing of that, it just seems personal to me. For sure we could have done that one earlier. This is really making me work now. But there they are, all crusty, made of 100% pure unobtainium. Can't buy these. They're not perfect, but they're the best ones I'm ever going to have. So I'm going to make the best of these before rust wins. Those things right there that look like boots, yeah, those are really just shock absorbers. Righty-lefty matters, and if you're paying attention, the inner nylon sleeve on the inside of the cable, one's white, one's black. The black one is right, the white one is left. The brackets are all actually the same, only their orientation changes. All of this could have been cleaned up and put on earlier, just saying. I started by media blasting the brackets and making sure that I don't get them mixed up. I thought about replacing the O-rings, but both of them were astonishingly soft, pliable, and shiny, so they're not flat-spotted or anything. They actually look better than the new ones, so I put them back. I started cleaning up the rubber sheath cables with WD-40 until all of the dirt and oxides are gone. It doesn't soak into rubber, but I only use it for cleaning here. I wipe it on and I wipe it off. When I'm done, I go back over it with silicone grease. Mineral spirits could be used in dire circumstances, but in a very sparingly applied wipe on, wipe off, then immediately clean with window cleaner kind of way. Then moisturize again. Mineral spirits isn't great with many kinds of rubber, which is why all this other stuff is on my workbench right now to deal with its side effects. I used it only because I encountered a sticky, gooey residue that I wanted gone fast. Usually you can get away with cleaning up your old rubber parts with just the old WD, though. The silicone formula doesn't finish quite as flat as the regular formula, and it's friendlier to rubber, so I use it as a last pass. I used a Dremel and a fine buff on all the aluminum and steel parts to shine and polish the crust off of them. You can't argue with the results. These cables are 30 years old. All of the steel stuff is going to rust if I don't treat it, though. There was some zinc plating on the stuff once upon a time, but it doesn't last forever. It's steel, just like the rest of my other hardware, so I might as well make it match the rest of my hardware. This gave me a chance to clean up a couple of other parts that got away from me in the process. Just like the e-brake brackets, I figured I'd do the brake line brackets as well. Everything always looks so good coming right out of this process, but it doesn't offer near the protection that zinc or nickel plating provides. Which is why I clear coated them. So now they're rust-free but pre-oxidized and blackened, and sealed with a really thick coat of polyurethane. I totally didn't follow the thin coat directions, I just wanted them thoroughly sealed. I let it dry overnight, and then I put the cables back together again. Nobody but me ever does a brake job on their workbench. Doing the job on the car means the cable's already there in your way, leaving you no other choice. And you don't even need to remove the eccentric washer at all. You can just leave that thing hanging there too. But right here you can see why you put the big anchor spring on the outside, so that it's serviceable. And that's why that one's on the same pad as the e-brake lever. That's the only one you need to take off. This is helpful to know for anyone who breaks their emergency brake cable. If your brakes were assembled correctly, you only have to take the side off that has the parking brake lever on it. There you go. The whiteboard told me it did it this way because it wanted you not just to know where the things go, but why. So I told it I was sorry for speaking ill of it, and it let me off the hook without having to do the ABS sensors for now. Thank goodness. It was totally about to hammer us with an 8th parts group too, and I'm glad we talked. I call these R-clips because I'm a moron. Nobody told me to rename them. E-clips was already taken, so. After the cable's fully inserted, and as long as the groove for the clip isn't obstructed by powder coat or paint, then these should just snap right through that groove and secure the cable. That's all that keep these in there, so make sure you put it back. Twist and pull on it just to make sure it worked.
Oh, is this like a bop it?
Maybe.
You can see just how little room you have to work with here. This drum setup is less complicated than most drum brake systems because there's no hydraulic cylinder in it. It's only cable actuated. But the trade-off of that simplicity is having to do this job completely blind with a hub in the way. Knowing how, where, and why everything fits is how you do it blind. It can take multiple tries to get everything to stay put, even when you know what you're doing because everything's spring-loaded. It's even harder chasing it around on your workbench, and I'll explain my reason for doing it the hard way in a minute. Many of Mitsubishi's Halo models have this setup with redundant rear brakes on them, making it a friendly thing to move parts around and swap between models for upgrades. The drum brake's aligned inside the hat of the brake disc rotor, so naturally you need that rotor too. The Gallants have this, Evo 9s have bigger rear brakes than the 2Gs, and the 10s even bigger than the 9s. Good luck finding them though. These brake line brackets have the perfect amount of contrast for my liking, and that's everything that I can assemble without the axles and the suspension. So now that the whiteboard and I are friends again, I went ahead and I wrote all the torque specs up on the board for every one of these part groups, with the few number of bolts that are in them that even require it. But anyway, some of these bolts don't even have a spec, like all the ones for the e-brake cables, for instance. But this is 6 parts groups completely assembled, and as I showed you, there were pieces of the 7th. And I've even got an 8th parts group that's connected to the knuckles as well, the ABS sensors. Fortunately, thanks to an awesome viewer named Chris Duncan, who gave me one brand new rear right ABS sensor, the one I destroyed trying to take that axle loose, I was able to buy the other sensor I destroyed brand new. Here's the front right, both of the rights went, and I have all 4 of them, so I was ready for the whiteboard if that happened. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I needed your support with this one, and that's awesome. I can't wait to put those on there, but I'm not ready for those yet. I got to get all this put back on the car and get it rolling first. We'll be doing the electrical stuff later, but I have them, and there's actually 11 parts groups that connect to all of these knuckles, and the rest of them are going to be the suspension arms and members, and as you saw, one of the pieces of the subframe was on it, and then you got axles. So it's a very busy parts group, and it's an important thing for me to have done and prepared in advance of hanging all the arms on there, because this is just one thing, just boom, once I get them on there, we get to roll. Right about now, my Patreons are wondering why I didn't install these Brembo brakes I stole from Chad and replaced with some other old beat-up junk that was just laying around. He'll never notice. My Patreons know I acquired these things for the GSX, but I just put my factory brakes back on here like I'm trying to be the service manual or something. These Brembos also happen to be already coated by Detective for an additional fit to this project, and they look absolutely sick in addition to being a huge performance upgrade. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the factory brakes on any street-driven GSX. They'd be great for up to low 10s, no problemo, and here you go. Just like that, I undid a quarter of my progress in less than 10 seconds. Yeah, but this upgrade creates several other problems that I haven't solved yet, and I'll show you here. You'll notice the rotor is more than an inch larger than the factory rotor. Goodbye factory dust shields and wheels then. That might not be a problem for most, and it won't be for me. I just don't have those wheels that let me fit that rotor and this gigantic caliper inside of them yet. But I do have the rotors and the calipers ready to go. In addition to the bigger rotor, you get a good bit more pad surface area over the factory units too. I bought a set of Evo brake dust shields that I can modify to fit these 2G knuckles, and those can take the place of the restored 2G units I currently have. They're different for the right and left sides too, so I've got 2 different part numbers for those. I've even got a set of the adapter brackets that allow you to bolt these giant Brembos onto my factory knuckles. They came without instructions, but I'm a big boy now and I can figure out by test assembling and arranging the pieces what's necessary to install these. I can see that I need to grind part of the knuckle down because it interferes with the bracket. I need to clean up and grind areas around the bolts to let the spacers fully seat, and at that point I had to weigh the path that I've been going here, and with where I've been, and there's 2 different approaches to doing this mod. One is to use these adapters, and the other is using an expensive set of 7th generation Gallant knuckles that make it a bolt-on. Nothing personal to the guy who makes these brackets. His product isn't what made me not install these. It's a great product and it solves a problem for a part that you can't get, so I bought a set in order to show my support. Besides not wanting to grind these original knuckles because of their coatings and processes that they've been through up until now, I simply can't roll my car out of the shop without the wheels that I don't have so that I can clear my lift and move my GSX. Clearing my lift is far more important to me right now. Grinding anything is unnecessary since I don't have the wheels and it's in conflict with other progress. So there are facts on DSM tuners about where and what to cut if you use these brackets. And they're very well written. You can still buy these on eBay. But I'm just more inclined at my age to be the kind of guy that builds a whole new Gallant knuckle with the brake upgrade completed and swap the whole knuckle assemblies. And if and when that happens, I'm also the kind of guy who's going to give these brackets away to someone else in need because they are burly and they're definitely going to do the trick for them. But only time's going to tell if this is really the right car for this brake upgrade anyway. My GSX has a long history of other people's contributions of time and effort, and I wish to only amplify that in its restoration because all of its character is important to me. So we'll leave the original short production run, biggest brakes that you could get on a 2G on it instead. Shucks. My coatings are complete overkill, but there's the torque specs for all the 2G guys that want to see it all in one place. I'm torquing everything after the main assembly. My quest for 30-year-old factory parts is simply to maintain its originality everywhere that it counts. That's not easy to do today, but this effort is all for the sake of the car. I think it deserves it. Of those 8 parts groups that we've talked about here, there are only 48 bolts total, including all the random ones that secure cables, brackets, and sensors. The grades are all very specific. The calipers and bearings all get grade 10s, and just those make up half of them. The strut bolts are 8s. All the cable stays, dust shield bolts, and ABS bolts are 4s, and they make up about a third of them. That's not many. And it's the health of all those things that they secure that matters the most because all this is safety equipment. So from the bushings to the bearings, the sensors, and 3 sets of brakes, this is the stuff that matters, and that's why getting the bolt grades, threads, and lengths right is so important here. The order of assembly is just for security and serviceability. But there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of GSX Progress, and until next time, stay tubed!